Hi, I'm Heather Telford and I'm happy to be back on YouTube with you today to share a card making video. I'm working with Splitcoaststampers and I'll be showing you some of my favorite techniques for making alcohol ink backgrounds, which I'll then turn into Christmas baubles and put on some clean and simple Christmas cards. I'm working on a craft mat. This is an impermeable mat, so none of the ink soaks in and it's easy to move around on the slick surface of the craft mat. I'm using 3 different colors and just dropping ink on randomly in a little bit of a mix there, and then adding a little bit of rubbing alcohol. You can use rubbing alcohol or blending solution, which helps the ink to move around a little more freely and also dilutes the colors a little bit. The paper I've got in my hand is Yupo paper, and it is not paper as such. It's a plastic form of paper, and so the ink sits on top and continues to move even after you apply it. So you can see that I swiped it through a few times, and then I wanted a little bit more of the darker color, so I added some more to the mat and then you continued to pick it up on the paper. And each time you apply ink, it moves, the ink itself moves, but it also pushes some of the ink that's already there in different directions. That also happens when you apply rubbing alcohol or blending solution on top. It drops into the ink and starts moving the ink around, creating new patterns and shapes. So you can see I added some rubbing alcohol and it made little bubbles, and then I added kind of a stream of it along the top and it blended into the color that was already there. What it also does is it makes a path for more ink. So after I'd added the rubbing alcohol, I added some more ink and that moved more freely. But you can see it doesn't move everywhere. It will move more easily in the areas that are still wet than the areas that have dried. So this technique, working with a mat where you pick up color, is something that I could just play with. But you know, I did one final swipe and then I set that one aside. And then because there was so much ink left on the mat, I added a bit more rubbing alcohol to dilute it. And then I picked up a second print quite quickly, and that's a lighter print, just using the rest of that ink. I let those dry, and then I decided to add a splatter of different colors on top. The colors I used to splatter are a little bit different. They're called mixatives in the range of alcohol inks, and they have a ball bearing in them. You have to shake them up. They've got particles in them that tend to settle, so you shake them up. And then I'm just using an old paintbrush to pick up some of that ink and then splatter it over my panel with a toothbrush. I'm after the look of snow, and so that alcohol ink there is called Snow Cap, and it's white. It did end up soaking into my blue a little bit, so it's not a particularly contrasting pattern, but you can see it close up. Then on the other paler panel, I went with some silver. Again, I had to shake it up quite vigorously, and then I squeezed some out on my mat and again picked it up with an old paintbrush. It doesn't do the bristles of the paintbrush any good to be in alcohol ink, so I just save a few of my old ones. And then I flicked that silver over the panel, and it didn't really move around or soak in. It sat on the surface. It reacted a little bit differently to the white. And I've got a little spray of silver dots. My second technique that I'm showing you is to apply the alcohol inks with a felt applicator. So I'm just dabbing little drops of 3 different colors onto the applicator, randomly placed so that they're in a little mix. And then I'm going to apply them to the Yupo paper, same sort of paper, but I'm applying them with the applicator. And what happens is the ink is applied to the Yupo paper, but again, it doesn't stop moving. It doesn't just print and stay like that. It continues to spread as it hits the Yupo paper. And then every time I dab on top of it, it picks a little up, drops a little down, and creates really tiny patterns of alcohol ink. And they get tinier and tinier the longer you do this. And you can keep changing it. You can add a little bit more of one color if you want that color to be a little more prominent in the pattern. So I did that here with some blue. And then I also added a little bit more blending solution and printed with that as well. So got some more patterns. And then when I was happy with it, I set that aside and did it with a couple of other colors. Just to show you that it doesn't really matter how you apply your alcohol ink to the felt pad that you're using. I did a couple of lines and then I printed them kind of as a pattern, but then I kept on doing the kind of dabbing in different ways until I had filled my space with those two colors. And a little bit of rubbing alcohol as well to just keep the colors moving and fill the pattern in a little bit more. So you can see I ended up with quite a subtle pattern with the first colors and then a little bit more of a bold pattern for the second lot of colors. My final technique is one that I use to create a pattern that looks a little bit like the Northern Lights. I apply my alcohol ink onto the same Yupo paper again in 3 lines, and you can see that I'm not aiming to cover the whole piece of Yupo paper. I'm actually leaving that strip of white on one side on purpose because I want that to be kind of the edge of the snow. And then I'm just tilting the Yupo paper in order that the ink will flow with gravity. And as soon as I add a bit of alcohol ink, the existing ink that's on the panel flows even more easily. And I'm just basically turning it around, tipping it and tilting it until I get that ink filling more of the panel. What you can see though is it doesn't want that amount of ink doesn't want to fill the whole area. It doesn't spread. So what I do is continue to add more inks, but also I'm spreading the ink manually with that little Q-tip in order to make a path for the ink to flow into. The Q-tip itself doesn't really paint a pattern, but what it does is spread the ink around. So now the ink will flow into those areas where it wasn't flowing before. And if you think that the Q-tip actually makes it less attractive, don't worry about it because the ink keeps moving and the pattern that is there in 1 second will have changed into something else the next second. So you can see that this is quite an addictive little technique because you just keep playing with colors and droplets and blending solution and make those colors move around till you're happy with what they're doing. And if you play with the alcohol inks for a little while, you'll see that different ones do different things. Some of them will blend with each other and some of them will repel each other. So it depends a little bit on the colors and the mixes, what you'll get. But I just like playing with them. And you can see that I've created a second hard edge on there. And when I've finished with this pattern, I'm happy with what the colors are doing. Then I can decide whether I'm going to use one of those white edges or the other, and it becomes the surface of the snow, and then all the colored area is the Northern Lights in the sky. When I had finished all my panels, those 3 different techniques that I've showed you, I used a whole bunch of circle dies and started cutting circles out of those panels. And I had some dies that already had a little loop at the top to make a bauble, and I also had some patterned bauble dies that I cut coordinating cardstock. I cut them out of coordinating cardstock to lay over the alcohol ink backgrounds that I'd created. So I just used plain circle dies to cut a lot of circles of different sizes, and then some of the coordinating cardstock dies. And I also used some tree dies that I have. One to create a border of trees that made it look like there was snow underneath, and then a few tree dies to just lay on top of the alcohol ink balls that I'd cut. And then that last one, that last background I did, I cut a cardstock, a white cardstock deer to sit on top of that one. To put my cards together, I just put a strong glue on the back of all my little circles. And then when I had cut a cardstock die cut to coordinate, I glued that over the top. And then I made little silver bows for the top of these baubles, these Christmas balls, or Christmas baubles as I like to call them. And I attached that. I wasn't going to fiddle around with a string going up because, as you can see, this is almost a one-layer card. So to get a string, an actual cord to go up, I would have had to have somewhere to put the end, and I decided to use a different method. You can see a little more closely this border tree die that I used. I cut a white cardstock circle, the same size as the Yupo paper circle that I'd cut, and then I stuck my tree cut die piece on top, and so it looks like the white circle underneath looks like the snow. So it's a clever little die to create your tree line border there. And I just used a sand eraser to smooth the edges of my die cutting. The Yupo paper, I don't know, it came out a little rough, and a sand eraser just sanded those edges down for me. And I continued to add little silver bows to the ones that I wanted to be baubles, but I also created a few that just, I guess they looked a little bit more like snow globes, so they didn't have a bow and a string on top. To create the look of the string, since I wasn't going to fiddle with a single piece of cord, I used a silver gel pen instead and my T-square ruler, and just added that little cord with silver gel pen. To finish the cards, I grabbed the Holiday Snippets stamp set from Penny Black, which has a whole bunch of Christmas sentiments or holiday sentiments that I could add to the bottom of the cards. And I just wanted something little because I wanted to keep the Christmas balls as the focus. I just added those with VersaFine ink, which does such a nice job of really fine stamping. Sorry that my head keeps popping into the frame there. That was just as I leaned over to make sure I was getting it square. And you might be able to see that there's a second stamp on that block. That stops me from rocking the stamp. I just ink one. I ink the stamp that I want, but then I pop that uninked stamp back on to keep the block level as I stamp. This little trick I learnt from someone a while ago. So this is one of the cards here that I decided not to turn it into a Christmas ball as such, more like a snow globe background. So I've stuck the alcohol ink circle on, and then I've stuck a die cut tree in the front, and then did the same thing with my Northern Lights sky. And you can see that that one bit of Yupo paper that didn't get ink on it, that has become the snowy ground that the deer is standing on. So thanks for watching. I hope you've got a few ideas for playing with alcohol inks, and then some really easy ideas for turning those alcohol ink backgrounds into Christmas cards. If you give it a try, I'd love to see what you do or hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment and let me know how you found this technique. Thanks for watching.